Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a weekend reads / wrap-up. The book that I'm currently in the middle of reading is called Visit Sunny Chernobyl, the subheading on which is And Other Adventures in the World's Most Polluted Places. This was written by Andrew Blackwell, who's primarily a journalist, so you'd think that this would be primarily journalism about polluted places, but it's actually more of a travelogue or a piece of travel writing in which he essentially goes for holidays in incredibly polluted places. The places he visits includes obviously Chernobyl, which is on the front, but also the oil sands in northern Alberta, the refineries of Port Arthur in Texas, Great Pacific Garbage Patch. He goes on a sailing trip to go and find that. He goes to a deforested area in the Amazon, which isn't so much polluted as damaged, so that didn't seem quite in line with everything else. He also goes to a very polluted river in India and to a coal mining area of China. Now, the last two chapters I haven't gotten to, but I have gotten through most of this. My main impression of this is that it is mostly interesting because a lot of the style of tourism that he talks about is actually stuff that it has become much more common just in the 5 years since he's written this book. He actually makes the point in the Chernobyl chapter that he went just a year before it became such a big tourist thing, and now as a tourist, you can go and book the same tours that he had to book as a journalist at the time that he went, which is interesting. And some of it's interesting just because there's been a shift in the way certain things are viewed. Like, he goes to Port Arthur, and this was obviously written before Hurricane Harvey, when, Port Arthur was just so flooded at that time. Although he does end up being there when there were a couple of oil spills, so that's interesting. He's up at the oil sands before the current bust happened. So when he's in Fort McMurray, it's a very different Fort McMurray than exists now. I think if you're familiar with any of these things, if you have read other books about, say, the oil industry in North America, or about what happened at Chernobyl, or about deforestation in the Amazon, this is very superficial and very kind of Wikipedia entry history, and then the travel bits. If you are interested in seeing what this style of kind of ecotourism looked like 5 years ago, before the kind of current trend of going as a tourist to places that aren't the typical museums and sightseeing type tourism, it's kind of interesting. And as an introduction to some of these places, I think that could be interesting. As someone who has been associated with a lot of people who, for example, worked in Fort McMurray or in Port Arthur, and who's read a number of other books about Chernobyl lately, I felt like this was a little bit superficial, but I don't think it's meant to be something deeper. I think looking at this, you expect something that's hard-hitting journalism, and it is travelogue. So prior to that, I read kind of an odd little collection of Samuel R. Delany's writing. This is called The Atheist in the Attic, and it includes the novella The Atheist in the Attic, which, despite the fact that Samuel R. Delany is primarily a science fiction or speculative fiction author, that is a piece of historical fiction in which Leibniz goes and visits Spinoza and discusses Spinoza's work on ethics, which was, I believe, published after Spinoza's death, and this is right before that. And it has a subplot in which Leibniz is staying at his friend's house and can't figure out if his friend's servant is hitting on him or has a weird fetish, when it seems pretty clear that the servant is actually looking to be rescued from being used in medical experimentation, which is interesting. I don't know how broad the appeal of that story is, because it kind of assumes that you know about the disaster year that happened in the Netherlands, where they had a couple of major military defeats with the French and the English, and then people were starving in the countryside, as well as knowing about Leibniz and Spinoza's work. But if those things do interest you, you might enjoy the story. So in addition to that, this collection also includes an essay called Racism in Science Fiction, which was written in 1998, I believe, but is actually about things that were happening mostly in the 60s and 70s. What's interesting is that there's then a postscript in here in which the publishers asked Delany if he had anything to add, and he points out that he did predict the way things would go, the attitudes within the industry as the works being put out by major publishers did become more diverse, and then you look at the controversies that have happened in science fiction things, like in the Hugos and whatnot, and he did predict a lot of things that have happened, so that was interesting. And then the final piece is an interview, which wasn't that thrilling, but was interesting enough. If you've read other interviews with him, I think it's a little redundant, but if you haven't, it's not a bad introduction. It's kind of a weird collection of things to be tied together, but I think this is put out by PM Press, and that seems to be their, I was gonna say their shtick, that sounds dismissive, that seems to be what they put out, which, you know, interesting enough. Next up, I picked up something that I have seen a lot of people on BookTube talk about for various readathons, and that is Maggie Thrash's graphic memoir, Honor Girl. This is essentially a coming-of-age story in which the author recounts her experience as a teenager, basically coming to terms with her sexuality while at summer camp, and the framing device is that she is about to meet this camp counselor that had her kind of first love experience with at summer camp. The framing pieces I thought were too short and didn't really go anywhere, which I think is realistic in terms of how a lot of relationships that you've maybe idealized in your head would go, but as something that frames the story, I thought that was a little bit weak. But the main story, the bit at the summer camp, is charming and kind of feels authentically like young teenagers at summer camp. I thought some of it was funny in how kind of, I don't want to say conservative because I don't mean that in a political sense, but how almost naive the kids are, because I mean, this author is quite a bit younger than I am, and I feel like my social circle at 15 was not nearly as sheltered as these kids were, which was interesting, which I think is somewhat part of Anglo-American culture to a certain extent, but I did think that was kind of an interesting thing. The art style is a little bit too simplistic for my taste, so it never completely gelled with me, but I did think this was overall pretty charming. Yeah, I know the author has what I believe is another memoir out now, so I might try to pick that up. So next up, I read a piece of franchise fiction, and that was Dragon Age Deception. This is a comic book collection that follows a few characters in the Dragon Age universe. Basically, criminals trying to redeem themselves, possibly. This is probably one of the weakest pieces I've seen in the Dragon Age universe. I've overall been pretty impressed with most of the comics that have come out, at least recently. I think there was a prequel comic that wasn't very good, but this, however, was fine. There wasn't necessarily anything wrong with it, although I never... the style of the art, which is by Fernando, Heinz, Furukawa, and this is written by Nunzio, DeFilippis. It's passable. It's okay. There's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but it's just a generic fantasy story. We do see one-off appearance of Alistair in the king form, which is how you see him in most of the tie-in series, and we see some appearances from Dorian from Dragon Age Inquisition, but this is primarily about new characters, and we never really get enough time with them to develop any of it. Yeah, it's a passable fantasy action story, but nothing particularly great. I also picked up an arc on NetGalley of a comic that came out recently, or a collection that came out recently, and that is the first volume of Into the Blue, which is a World War II Air Force type comic written by Garth Ennis and drawn by Keith Byrne. The art is overall pretty good, especially in the action sequences and the sequences with the planes in the air and in combat. The faces were a little generic for my tastes, and if there weren't a couple of features that worked as shorthands for two of the characters, it would have been hard to tell them apart, and I think the fact that I could only tell them apart because, okay, that's the guy who has the facial scars and that's the guy who's the brown guy, but everybody else looks the same. Not super impressive on that point, but the flight scenes were really well done. This is in line with most of Garth Ennis's war comics. If you've read Battlefields or War Stories, you'll know more or less how this goes. He plays with some of the common tropes that you see of a Second World War story and takes them to, I guess, less of a sanitized way if you're used to seeing the kind of propaganda version or the romanticized version. So I was entertained by this, but if you are not a fan of Garth Ennis's style of war storytelling, I don't know that you would be. I think it's very in line with the rest of his work within this genre. So while I was reading all of that, I also listened to 2 audiobooks, one of which was W. Kamau Bell's The Awkward Thoughts of W. Kamau Bell, which he narrates the audiobook himself, which is normally the way I think is the right way to consume celebrity memoirs. But in this one, it really drew attention to the thing that has always turned me off of his stand-up, which is that he really over-describes things. I always find that his comedy, as opposed to his TV series, which tend to be a little bit more serious, he tends to over-explain things. And I realize that he's doing that because he's trying to do this kind of edutainment thing, but it becomes a bit tedious because he'll tell you one thing and then he will over-explain it. So listening to 7 hours of him over-explaining things, I wasn't thrilled with it, and if I had read it, I would have skipped over some of the parts. I mean, when it is funny, it's funny, but honestly, I wasn't that impressed with it, and it's a shame because he does make a lot of worthwhile political and social commentary in this, but a lot of it is so straightforward that there's really no need for this let's explain this to death element that he adds in there, so I wasn't thrilled with that. And then on the flip side, kind of that, I also listened to Clinton Kelly's memoir, I Hate Everyone Except You, also read by the author. And that was interesting because there was a lot of stealth commentary in his stories, but it had almost the opposite problem in that the stories were all fairly short and didn't have the explanation, which in parts I appreciated, especially when he was talking about his family history, because I think there is a tendency of at least a lot of the kind of public persona type people to over-explain their childhood challenges, where in his case he very quickly introduces the fact that when his parents got divorced, he and his mother and sister lived with a group of other single-parent families, all in the same household. And it's just left there. There's no digging down to it, whereas I see a lot of celebrity memoirs, they kind of over-explain that kind of thing, and he doesn't do that. As the story goes along, it assumes that you're picking up on things. Like, there's a certain point through most of the stories that he's telling, which are more or less, although not completely in chronological order, he refers to his stepfather by his first name, and then in the final couple of chapters he's calling him Dad, so you can see that their family dynamic has changed over the years, but he doesn't hit you over the head with it. Now, I think in some parts it suffers because of that, because he's not explaining any background stuff. It draws attention to the fact that what you're getting is a lot of kind of catty stories, which is his public persona. He was one of the hosts of the US What Not to Wear, where their whole shtick is talking about how poorly people dress. So he's not nearly as critical in this as he is in that show, but at the same time it does make it seem a lot more superficial than I think it would have even if it had a couple of extra lines here and there. I will also note that he reads really quickly. I think the book is a standard length, but the audiobook is only about 5 hours long, which is fine, but if you are someone, and I know there are a number of people who listen to audiobooks on double time or something like that, which I don't do because I feel like you're missing the acting part of it, but whatever. But if you did that, I don't think this would be understandable at all because he speaks really quickly to begin with. Anyway, I feel like I've probably forgotten something, but I'll include that in next time because there's too much construction outside for me to keep going with this. Anyway, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.